affirmation we're using this morning is divine love is doing its perfect work right now. That's a old affirmation that is universally applicable. How many of you have problems? No problems right now. Have you ever had a problem in your life? If you don't have problems today, have you had a problem? Of course you have. Everyone has. It's part of the human condition. We have problems. And so the affirmation is divine love is doing its perfect work right now. We have a foundation teaching and understanding that is integral to what New Thought and practical spirituality is all about. And we may not behave as though it's operating. We may not believe that it's operating. And so these affirmations are designed to recondition our thinking and to deal with our subconscious mind. What is our question? What great good wants to come into my life right now? A few moments ago, I asked if you had a problem, and of course, everyone has had a problem. Everyone's had a challenge. Everyone's had a difficulty, and everyone has had more than one. And everyone is going to have another, and another, and another. It's part of the human condition, and very often we believe that if we do something right, or if we get something right, or if we come to know the right thing, that we won't have problems. But the reality is that we don't need to avoid the problems. We need to be able to deal with the problems and to look at the problems and the challenges in our lives in a specific and certain way. And the way that we need to look at them is, the affirmation is, divine love is doing its perfect work right now. And that's it. That's it. The quotation today, God, Spirit, and the divine is everywhere present and accessible at all times. And so the presence of God, of the divine Spirit, whatever we choose to call it, that infinite intelligence is like air. It's even better, it's even more prevalent than air, because there are places where there isn't air, but there's nowhere that there isn't the presence of God. How many of you have read or well, you don't have to put your hands up, or even thought or affirmed the fact that in the midst of some terrible thing, raised the question of where is God? And in the midst of those circumstances, situations, where is God? Where is God? Right here? And if the problem is right here, where's God? Right there in the middle of the problem. God is in the middle of the problem. Now the divine didn't create the problem. Probably what created the problem was our mind, or circumstance or situation, or our behavior. But the challenges and circumstances that we face in life are solved very, very simply if we really apply the principles. And the simplicity of it is in the affirmation of the power and presence of God, always present in the midst of every circumstance. I want to talk to you today about my own problems, and because everyone has problems. And I'm going to talk about two particular problems that I faced in my life. One was a few years ago, and some of you know about it, was an occasion when I was being sued. You know, that's not a great experience. And I was being sued by a client that had been a client for 16 years, great friends, wonderful, a magnificent relationship. And then a series of events took place, and unhappiness came, and a lot of falsehood took place. But that's not important. But out of it, what happened was I got sued. And I got sued for $14 million. And so I didn't work for almost 3 years. But one of the things that I consistently did was apply the principles. One of the things that I consistently do, and that every true student is invited and called to do, even if it's difficult, even if you aren't good at relying upon the principles, the more you rely on the principles, the better you get at claiming them. Because it isn't through our thoughts or our belief that we validate this teaching. The teaching operates on the basis of principle. So it's always operating. So in the midst of every problem, you affirm that statement and you ask that question. There's great good coming. And why is there great good coming? There's great good coming because good is all there is. The lawsuit was real, but it was real only here in this little tangible world that we see, but it did not permeate the universe. It did not taint the presence of God, and it didn't negate the principles. And so the principles were operating. Mary Baker Eddy taught us, and she brought forth the magnificent, wonderful teaching of seeing beyond appearances. And Mrs. Eddy said, the foundress of Christian Science, lots of what we see in life and in the world is appearance. Paul said it differently. He said, we see dimly. We see through smoke or cloud. We don't see clearly what's really there. But if we could see clearly, then the reality and truth of God's presence is there. Well, let's do the quotation. God, Spirit, and the divine is everywhere present and accessible at all times. And if that's true, then what we are called to do is to affirm it, to see it, despite appearances to the contrary. Despite appearances to the contrary. Now, that doesn't mean that we deny what's there. It doesn't mean that in the case of the lawsuit, you don't have to defend yourself. It doesn't mean that you don't have to do certain things that are necessary. And so we go back to the lawsuit, and that was going on for almost 3 years. And in that 3-year period, there was the affirmation and the principle and the understanding that that was just an experience. But the reality was that the divine laws and truth were operating. And after the 3-year period, the lawsuit was settled and nothing came of it. The vast majority of that time, from my own perspective, as difficult as it was to not focus upon that issue, but to focus upon the truth. Because teaching says that the truth shall set you free. And if you and I rely upon that truth, then we see beyond the burden of what appears and the manifestation and truth come forth. The second one is a health issue, and we've all had health issues. And I broke this hip, and then I broke this hip, then I broke my leg, and I broke my other leg. And so for 3 years, there was fractures. And so then again, the affirmation and the question and the quotation were and continue to be the foundation response to that circumstance and situation. And here I am standing here, and we're growing bone. And every single one of the denominations and groups in New Thought and practical spirituality or Christianity were founded upon healing principles, because all of the founders needed healing. All of them need healing, and all of them were healed. And the healing came because they understood the principles, but not called upon the principle like we're drawing it to us, because it wasn't drawn to me in the physical sense of the healing, and it wasn't drawn in the solution to the legal problems. It was always operating. The divine law was always operating, and what was on the surface was this horrible, terrible problem. And in the midst of the horrible, terrible problem, there was the question, what great good wants to come into my life right now? And you know what problems do? They remind us that the good is there. They remind us that the good is there. In the midst of the most difficult situation or circumstance, where is God? Right there. Right there. So when the lawsuit came, that was a piece of paper that I could have focused on, or we can claim the reality and truth of the presence of God and allow that reality and truth to come forth. And not to come forth as something new that we've drawn out, but to come forth into our vision, into our mind, and into our experience. What kind of problems do you have in your life? Financial, emotional, business, relationships, people. Look at the people. Those events come for wonderful, wonderful opportunities so that we can see good. That's a hard and difficult lesson to learn, but it is fundamental to the teaching. It's not enough to read it and know it on an intellectual level, but we are called to demonstrate it. And it sounds really trite and flippant when you say everything that comes into our lives is coming to help us realize and understand the reality of the presence of good and the presence of God. but that's the truth. The good news is that God is everywhere present. Paul said all things work together for good. He didn't say the good things work together for good. He said all things work together for good. The good news is that every circumstance, situation in your life, in my life, and in all of our lives, everything that takes place on this planet, everything that we can conceive or experience calls us to understand and realize the great good that's there and to allow that principle to operate in our lives. We can let go of the stress. We can be assured of the outcome in a positive and affirmative way. So this week, ask yourself this question: what great good wants to come into my life right now? And in order to answer that question effectively and easily, simply think about the challenges, the difficulties, the problems, the hiccups that you have in the midst of your life. And the good that wants to come forth is the realization and understanding of the quotation that God is everywhere present and accessible at all times. And if God is everywhere present and accessible at all times, then that's the solution. That solves everything. And if divine love is doing its perfect work in my body, and divine love is doing its perfect work in my finances, divine love is doing its perfect work in my relationships, divine love is doing its work in my business, divine love is doing its work in the world, divine love is doing its work in global economic problems, divine love is doing its perfect work in every single thing, and the realization of that comes into our being, then we see things completely differently. We see everything completely differently, and the solutions come with some clarity. So go out there and look for a problem this week.